Hey entrepreneurs, if you're a fan of organizational health from Pat Lencioni, you're going to be a fan of this podcast. Today we hear from Gordon Blocker, who went in 8 short years from being handed his first Pat Lencioni book to he was a member of Pat Lencioni's leadership team for the Table Group. On this podcast, Gordon, who's an absolute student of the game, talks to us about the 4 disciplines of organizational health, a number of books of Pat Lencioni's that he has read multiple times, and books outside of the Lencioni series that he references when he does his consulting work. Get your pen ready to take some notes with Gordon Blocker. Hey Gordon, welcome to the Entrepreneurs United podcast.
Hey Rich.
Happy to have you on. If you could start off, just tell us a bit about your career path and what led you to what you're currently doing and a little bit about what you're doing now.
Yeah, I'll just maybe do it in reverse. So for the last 8 years or so, I've been working for the Table Group led by Pat Lencioni, good friend and mentor and leader, and lots of stories there. And basically what we do is our purpose is to help make work more fulfilling by making organizations healthier. To do that, we have to help leaders master some really important disciplines. The first is to build cohesive leadership teams. The second is to create clarity for those teams and their whole organization. The third is to over-communicate that clarity, which a lot of leaders take for granted and misunderstand. And the last is to reinforce that clarity by creating healthy human systems. And that leads to what I did before, because before Table Group, I was in a consulting firm as a principal with 2 partners. And the way I got this whole work started is in 2007, my partner handed me the 5 dysfunctions of a team. I'd never heard of Pat Lencioni. I'd never heard of the book. But when I read it, everything seemed familiar. And I remember going back to him and asking him the hard question, which is, why did he give it to me? I was wondering if he thought is because I was doing something dysfunctional or our clients dysfunctional. And he just said something very disarming to the effect of, I think this is a lot about us and we need to work on this stuff. And my 3 partners and I would just literally give each other's Pat's books for Christmas gifts. At that time, he had written about 7. And so we'd give them to each other. We'd go for quarterly offsites. We'd talk about it. And so I understand what it's like to be on both sides of the table in the work, in the sense that we're just human beings. The reason why we call ourselves Table Group is that Pat said when he founded the company that the table is the most powerful tool for an organization. We've got computers, we've got technology, we have apps, we have all kinds of processes, we have big data. But when you get 4, 5, 6, 7 people that are humble enough to just have the conversations and draw out their smarts, the best decisions are made, and it's still the best tool. So that's what we try to do, is just pull the leaders together around the table, help them make great decisions, sometimes help them make less dumb decisions, because smart people do make really, really dumb decisions. And the reasons are often because of the politics of the organization, the confusion, low morale, low productivity, lots of turnover. Unfortunately, that creates misery and a lack of fulfillment. And that's what we're here to try to change.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Can you share about how many clients do you work with at a given time? And then if you wanted to share some of the clients' names, either who you work with that would be well known, or clients' names who work with the Table Group in general.
Mm-hmm. It depends on how much we work with them. I mean, I might work with a client for a single day. We might do something, and that might be all that they need. We'll do maybe an initial offsite or 1 or 2 days with a leadership team. And then probably long-term would be, we've known each other, Rich, for 4 to 5 years. And I think the long-term relationships are more about the seasonality. There are times when I'm like, hey, Rich, we haven't talked in a year or so. How are things going? And there's times when we dive in with a change effort. So it can really go that range. We would say organizational health itself, there is no timestamp. You're always working on these disciplines. You don't always need consultants. You don't always need help. And then in terms of the range of clients, I mean, it's amazing because while I don't have a exact figure, I can't name an industry we haven't worked in. I can't name a size company I haven't touched, all the way from a 5-person startup to, a Fortune 50 company. what's really crazy about our work is I might talk to those two people in side by side in 2 consecutive hours or 2 consecutive days. And here's what's crazy. The dynamics between a nonprofit, tiny little company in Idaho might have the very same dynamics as a Fortune 50 oil company in Tennessee. It's just crazy. So industry and those kind of things don't always influence organizational health as much as the situation and the personalities around the table.
Can you expand on you had mentioned politics, you had mentioned dysfunction. What are some of the things a company would be experiencing that would drive them to organizational health?
Well, one of the classic paths, because I will ask leaders, why are we having this conversation? What led to them coming to a place where they want to talk? And often is because they heard Pat speak or they read one of his books. I talked to a lot of leaders, and it comes down to, I was at the airport and I was at the store and I picked it up. And Pat's goal was, the reason why he wrote the books in a fable format is he wanted someone to be able to read a book on a flight from New York to LA, essentially. If I could write a book that's easy to consume. And what happens is, I think a lot of leaders, let's be honest, leaders struggle with ego, they struggle with pride, they struggle with fear. Pat's first book was called The 5 Temptations of a CEO. One of his latest books is called The Motive. There's these internal struggles, right? And I think what Pat does through just a disarming style is reduce those barriers and helps human beings say, you know what? Okay, let's just talk. I'm going to stop trying to put on a face. I'm going to try to stop impressing everybody. And I just want to talk. And I've watched rooms full of 1,000 people where in 45 minutes, Pat's able to, with humor and stories, help people go, yeah, I'm a human being. Let's just work on this. And so it's not so much of the what needs to happen as opposed to what barriers need to be removed so we could do some of the simple stuff.
Thanks for that. Can you expand on each of the 4 disciplines, just briefly, not looking for a 20-minute monologue here, but just to expand on what is organizational health as defined by Pat Lencioni and the 4 disciplines?
Yeah, each one of them have a pretty simple drill down. So in terms of building a cohesive team, we'd say overcome 5 dysfunctions, which is an absence of trust, a fear of conflict, a lack of commitment, or I might say alignment, an avoidance of true peer-to-peer accountability. And the last one's a bit elusive. It says results, but it's an inattention to collective results. Rich, you and I have talked about this a lot. Are people motivated and driven by individual results or ultimately by a collective win for the organization or for the team? To overcome those 5 dysfunctions, we've identified actually 30 or 40 positive behaviors. So you could look at it from both sides. You could say, well, trust, that's not a dysfunction. That's just a word. So we have healthy behaviors and use those to start a benchmark of, okay, how frequently are these kinds of behaviors happening? Because these are the kinds of things that build trust. In terms of clarity, a lot of organizations have done lots of stuff on clarity, or what we would call clarity. Jim Collins, mission, vision, values. There are lots of people, I think, who emphasize a lot on clarity, and there's a lot of organizations that emphasize a lot on the first discipline of cohesion. What I love about what Pat did is he just broke down all the stuff around mission, vision, values, and broke it into questions and answers. And I think there's nothing simpler than a question that has a clear answer. So ours are, why do we exist? How do we behave? What do we do? How will we succeed? What's most important right now? And who does what? And you look at those, and some leaders will go, I'll go to lunch right now and pull out a napkin and I'll answer them. And that may be the case. But clarity is not just having the information or internal marketing. It's a tool for making decision. And what I find is when organizations are really clear on a few things, they allow people to do a lot of other things, including make mistakes, but just not in these 6 areas. And it empowers people. I'll pause on those first 2. You may have some questions about those 2 before I go to the next 2. But those 2 are the real hard work of a leadership team, especially when you're getting started on that work.
So just to make sure I understood, because there was a lot there and I couldn't even write fast enough, as I wanted to capture all of that.
No problem. It's in the book.
You really spoke to 2 things there. One was I think you were talking about like the 5 dysfunctions of a team, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that you guys came up with 30 to 40 positive behaviors that can really help, with those dysfunctions. And then you also talked about just the extreme clarity organizations need to have. Are those the two things you were referring to in the summary?
That's it. That's the first two disciplines.
And in the clarity, I got why, how to behave, and then I got the last one, which is who does what. But what were the two in the middle?
Okay. So there was why do we exist?
Yep.
How do we behave?
Yep.
Then what do we do, and how will we succeed? Yeah. Yep.
How to succead. Okay. And who does what, I think, was the last one.
The last one. Yeah. The fifth one is what's most important right now. We call that your playbook, so to speak.
Yep.
Great organizations probably have about 50 words collectively to the answers to those questions.
Yeah.
Or, one of our partners, Southwest Airlines, we said, hey, what are your three values? Boom, boom, boom. Warrior spirit, fun loving, servant's heart. And it's simple words, but they're not simple ideas, or they're not simplistic ideas. They carry with them endless amount of stories, examples. And what's most important, honestly, in getting clear is being really clear about what you're not. Being really comfortable on, okay, what's not the most important thing right now? How about the 50 things that are not the most important thing right now? And it's really what's not on the page, creating that white space, which is a great segue into discipline 3 and over communication. Why are people confused? Yep. We say too much stuff.
Yeah.
The noisy world. And we're like, oh, well, this is important and that's important. And it's like, well, you're not over communicating. You're just over informing me.
Yeah, no doubt. Gordon, one of the things that strikes me, we had the conversation with a recent guest as well, that, this whole, a magnet has two sides, right? One side can come together real fast, but you flip them around and they can't even be pushed together, right? Because if you know what your culture will not accept, sometimes that's easier, because over the years, unfortunately, there's been naysayers in the crowd, right? Oh, here we go with the values again. John and Rich want to sell me on the culture of the business, and yeah. And just like when you go to the casino and you play craps, some people play the pass lines, people play the don't pass line, right? And by having the reversal of it, to be able to say, let's forget about the value. Let's talk about what we will not accept in our culture. Really provides really strong clarity. One of the things that I know you talk a lot about is over communicating those. Mm-hmm. And we also had a conversation with Cameron Harold recently where he talked about, like, you have to create a cult-like culture in your organization, and if people don't like it, then they shouldn't be there. But how do you suggest, once you know why you exist and how you're going to behave and what you accept or don't accept, you made a point there just at the end about sometimes you over-inform versus over communicate. What is the difference there, and how can leaders make sure they're doing one versus the other?
Yeah. Well, first of all, a couple of misconceptions that will fuel confusion. One is that you can create culture. I don't think you create culture. It's too big to do that. You can shape it, you can steer it a little bit, but the reason why people balk at this stuff is because they're like, oh, it is contrived. And culture is what it already exists. Being proud of who you are and identifying those things first. Now, there may be some things about me and, let's say, my culture of my family, for example, that I'm not proud of. That's okay. Let's acknowledge that. But to sit there and say I'm going to create it is tough. The other thing that you said that I think is really important to distinguish is that we want to make culture a part of the business. Like, let's do the cultural work. Let's have the culture conversation. Now, Pat says that culture or organizational health is not a part of the meal. It's the plate on which the whole thing sits. So it's basically about creating the natural and just relaxing and saying, this is who we are. This is how we do it. So back to now over communication, we cannot overstructure that. Don't over programatize it. If I'm trying to cascade to you and I believe in something and I say, hey, John, let's get together. You can look in my eyes really quickly and know, is this a real conversation? Are you just telling me something that's really important? Or is this email marketing? Is this something where I'm just trying to convince you? And people can tell. So over programatizing it or over structuring it is what gets in the way. What people do appreciate is sincerity, vulnerability. They appreciate conversation. When I say, hey, John, I want to just tell you what I think is the most important thing right now. What do you think it is? And then you say, I think it's something else. And I say, hey, I appreciate you be able to say that. I think we're on a different page here. We got to get on the same page. Otherwise, our customers and our employees are going to be really confused. And we say, yeah, that's reinforcing that. Now, if the next week I start talking about something different, and you say, hey, Gordon, we're not going to over communicate if we just keep shifting. So that's the second reason I think people don't over communicate, is that we crowd them with too much information. And then two, we change a lot. Human beings are very impulsive, and leaders are very impulsive. And what we want to hear is, this is the same thing over and over and over, not because I'm trying to be redundant, because we made a commitment to do it, and I'm not going to shift and change. Alan Mulally, one of our heroes, walked into the Ford Motor Company in 2006, says, hey, we got to do these 4 things. After a while, at first Wall Street was like, oh, this is interesting, this is news, whatever. The team was like, okay, this is exciting. After a while, they're saying, hey, what's new? What else do you got for us? And he's like, we're not done with the first 4 things I said. And not one person on his leadership team was ever confused about the priorities, because he went over them every Thursday with his team, red, yellow, green.
Yeah. It almost seems to me too, I'm sure many people listening to this, and even myself and Rich as well, like we've been part of organizations where, they have the quote unquote proverbial poster on the wall. There may be one on your wall there, Rich,
totally.
behind you, right? And there's the poster on the wall, and it feels good. And you go to the conference and it's rah, rah, rah. And you even sit down with the leader, and they're sincere, they're communicating right. But then the actions don't follow the poster. The actions don't follow. Talk to me about that. I mean, we're talking about how to shape a culture, not create, which I love, and how you can over communicate. But over communicate is not just necessarily verbal; it's also actions. I would take it, right? And that's maybe a way to destroy what you're trying to mold.
Yeah, totally. And it's great segue into the 4th discipline, is reinforce clarity through healthy human systems. System sounds like what's a system, but a system is just how we do it, and how we have a little bit of structure without it becoming bureaucratic. And it's just trying to make things easier and easier and easier as we go. And so, for example, if I do say, let's say I think humility, our 3 values are humble, hungry, and smart. And we say humble, hungry, and smart, or an organization, to your point, has something on the wall that says we value humility. And I say, well, tell me about how your interview process. And they give me these. I mean, you've seen these. I mean, it's like the processes, the forms people fill out, the PDFs everywhere. It's like, show me your interview process. I don't see one aspect of that process that draws out someone's humility. It's like, well, we're not living this. We just said it. And you're absolutely right. The clarity has to map to the systems. We have a value of this. What's the system to draw it out? We have a strategy of that. What's the system? The problem is, we say systems as humans. One of the things we do as human beings is we overcomplicate everything. We just overcomplicate it, and that's why we get mired in it and we lose the value. So let me give you an example of not overcomplicating humility. Someone says, okay, we're going to have a process of checking if someone's humble. So when they walk into our office for an interview, our front desk, whoever's on the front lines, right there at the reception desk, that's our first interview. That person knows they're interviewing the person sitting in, and they don't know they're being interviewed. And they go to the second interview, walk into the office, into the boardroom, and say, how'd you like the first interview? They say, what are you talking about? Well, so-and-so out front. Oh, that person? I thought that was just, a peon or, some sort of frontline employee. I didn't think they're very important. Okay, got it. Well, we know what your value is in terms of hierarchy and status, versus someone who says, yeah, I chatted them up. I really learned about them. It's great to get to know them. Or you just ask your front desk manager and say, hey, what kind of impressions did you get from that person? And they're always being watched. And that's it. In 5 minutes, you can tell if someone's humble. Or I'll give you one more example that Pat uses in the book, Ideal Team Player. He says, let's say flexibility was your value, or agility. And he says, well, let them walk into the interview and go, hey, I forgot to pick up my dry cleaning. Why don't we go get it real quick? And just the look on their face will tell you if they're a flexible, agile person. That's a value. That's not a right and wrong. So it might be, hey, they're a good person, but you could test that really quick and say, we value agility, and that's how we find it out in an interview really quick.
Love it. And I love the reinforced clarity through the systems and hold that accountable. But ultimately, you started with this. When things are, questionable, it's not the systems or the apps or the software or whatever, It's the table. Let's get back to the table, right? To realign. I have, a question here that is just coming back to me. You started off by reading a book of an author you had no clue about, and now you're working for his company. Can you please explain to me how that actually happens?
Yeah, it's very organically. And I think what we were just big fans, like I said, of Pat. I reached out to the table group simply as a fan and as a potential partner. I thought, wow, we've got clients, you've got clients. I just wanted to get to know them, get to know them. I was very, very happy in my partnership with my previous firm. My partners and I were doing well, and simply got into a friendship with Rick Packer, who's one of our more longstanding consultants out of Atlanta. And we just struck up a friendship. And basically, as simply as it sounds, in the midst of that friendship, he called me one day. He said, "You seem like you really love this organizational health stuff. You seem like you might be a good fit. Have you ever thought about potentially doing that?" And I said, "No, I haven't." But through the course of just conversation, I had clients and opportunities just to meet different people in the table group. And I actually had a client in the Bay Area, which is where our home office is, emphasis. And so I just went over to pop into the office one day after seeing a client, met Jeff, met Amy, our general manager, and I met Pat. And called my wife after the conversation and said, I just met Pat and Jeff and Amy, and then I went back and talked to my partners, and it was really hard because I love my partners. I still good friends with them and a big fan of my previous company, DSG Consulting. And yet I could sense this was a big opportunity as well. I probably didn't understand 1% of it at the time, but haven't looked back since. And actually still, even to this day, have great conversations with my previous partners about organizational health.
That's awesome. And I'm assuming, based on the values you shared with us that are the table group's values, they probably interviewed you, right, and evaluated you within those lenses as well, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
love that. I know, Rich. Every time we talk, not every time, very frequently when we talk, somehow, some way, shape, or form, a Pat Lencioni book comes up, and I can see one right behind you, right there. What's your favorite book? Rich.
Me, what's my favorite book? I'd say my favorite book's The Advantage, because The Advantage combines multiple of Pat's books into a functional approach on how a leadership team can use it, how ultimately that clarity can be cascaded throughout an organization. I'd be curious, Gordon, what your answer to that would be. What would your favorite book of Pat's be?
Man, it's so hard to pick, and I laugh because this summer my son and my partner's son are doing an internship with me, and I asked him to read every single one of Pat's books.
Oh wow!
And then write some things and talk about it. And I'll be honest, I reread Pat's books. I reread The Fable because I've had these experiences now with teams, and then I'm going back to the story. And one of my favorite rereads was The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, but I looked at it purely from the lens of what the leader does. So Catherine Peterson is the Fable. In The Fable, she's the CEO. She's this like superhuman, amazing leader. And I'll share it with, I probably already shared it with you, Rich, but I was just so amazed as how she handled the tension on the team. And I think that's one of the magical things that leaders do in healthy organizations is they manage tension. So sometimes they walk into the room, they feel the tension, they see the tension, and great leaders are like, hey, that's okay. Let's lean into this tension. Let's talk about it. Sometimes they disarm it and diffuse it and know when a little bit of humor is necessary. Sometimes they can see the tension and know that there's some politics going on and they confront it. But I just reread it, and I think the leader's role on the team and the team's behavior itself are so interconnected. And that's why 3 of Pat's books now, 4 Obsessions, The Motive, and The 5 Temptations are all with a lens on the leader. So 3 of his, 15 books are squarely focused just on how a leader shapes that. And I'm, as Rich knows, I love going one-to-one with leaders, getting into that space with them and helping them show up really well with their teams. And we know when a leader shows up really well with a team, they've got a great fighting chance.
And John had asked you the question, how do you go from reading a guy's book to then ultimately working for or with that person? Not only are you working for or with Pat, but you, for a period of time, were on Pat's leadership team yourself. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear about your experience on his leadership team and maybe how that was either similar or different than what you had experienced as a consultant prior to being on his leadership team.
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple of snapshots. Number one, we definitely drink our own Kool-Aid or our own champagne or whatever the metaphor is. We have our own thematic goal. We go through all their clarity. I mean, I'm working with teams right now, and we have a tool called the Meeting Advantage. So during a tactical meeting, we write up those clarity questions. That's the first thing. And I can tell you without a doubt, every tactical meeting I was in on the leadership team at the table group, I was asked, "Hey, Gordon, why do we exist?" We're going to start right there. And it's the simple stuff, but we got to practice what we preach, so to speak. So we had thematic goal, we had clarity, constantly looking through our defining objectives. The other snapshot that I would say on being on Pat's leadership team, or just engaging with him as a peer or as a part of a process, I would just say he pushes people so hard when it comes to overcoming fears. So our book on consulting is called Getting Naked. And it's basically about overcoming fears. And I can honestly say in the last 8 years, I've never been pushed harder. I've never been pushed into more vulnerable spots by Pat, by other. We have a very close-knit community, and a lot of us push each other. And it's about giving each other feedback. It's about getting into spaces and situations that are uncomfortable. And as Pat would say, entering that dangerous place. We call it entering the danger, leaning into it. And in the book, Getting Naked, it compares two consulting firms, sort of a more conventional consulting firm where you've got lots of splashy PowerPoints and lots of structure and trying to hide those fears. And then a very intimate, small boutique firm called Lighthouse Consulting, where they charge more, they have more intimate relationship with their clients, they're more informal. And it's just getting comfortable along that continuum to overcome your fears as a partner. Rich and I mean, that's probably the breakthroughs in our relationship, right? Rich is not the 5 years we've known each other, but the 5 hard conversations when I'm like, Rich, here's what I'm thinking. You're like, you're out. What are you talking? I don't even know what you're talking about. And then Rich's like, hey, can I just be vulnerable with you for a second and go, this is what I'm really dealing with. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's the breakthrough we need. And all I can say is just being a part of the community of the table group pushes you into and beyond your fears in ways I just can't even describe.
Thanks for that. The importance of having the right meeting cadence. What is it that you notice with companies who you begin your consulting work with on what their meetings look like? And then what ultimately is your recommendation on how they organize a meeting cadence?
Yeah, and that's the magic. First of all, I think every organization needs to take ownership of their own cadence. And often, like strategy, it's like, would you rather a good strategy or a bad strategy, or just no strategy? And very few organizations I've interacted with actually have a meeting strategy. They just have meetings. Like, how do we do it last week? Let's keep doing it. Let's meet. And so the first thing that's important for us, and I have to be honest, I've missed this many times, is just to listen, just to sit in on some meetings. That's actually what Catherine Peterson did in the first 2 months in her story in the book, 5 Dysfunctions. She just sat in on meetings. And I think we all, as outsiders or as partners, have to take some humility and say, hey, look, it's easy to be the side seat driver here, or the Monday morning quarterback, and just listen and get some context. But what Pat says about meetings, first of all, is that you have to differentiate between the types of meetings. You can't conflate multiple types of purposes into one space. So we have check-in meetings, which are largely about just quick information and visibility. We have tactical meetings, which are around execution of an existing strategy, trying to basically, let's just do it a little bit better this week. We have strategic meetings, which are solving bigger problems and rocks. And then we have offsites, which is the ultimate opportunity for a team to set quarterly direction for the organization. That's our cadence. It's not perfect. We think, though, I think in every case, it's a great lens to just say, okay, how are we reckoning with those 4 types of conversations? Where do you do it? Because as we talked about at CertaPro, Rich, one of my favorite conversations with CertaPro is we just said, okay, all that kind of stuff, it's happening somewhere. It might be through emails or text messages or conversations in the parking lot, but all that stuff is transacting. The question is, how intentional? What I find is the best organizations call their shots and they make their shots. And most organizations don't even call the shot. We're just throwing things up from every angle we can and just frantically having. I literally met with a team and we just said, let's just add up every hour you were in a meeting last week. And it's a shocking number, and it's a shocking number of ad hoc conversations. And here's the hardest question, though. I'll say, great. What was the meeting's intent? And you get a lot of looks like, I'm not really sure. And then I say, what was the most significant outcome of that conversation? And then you get some really disappointed looks, right? Because we waste so much time in meetings and people think, well, then I just need less time. We would say, no, you need better meetings. And if you have better meetings, you will be in the meetings less time, but the issue is quality, not quantity.
What do you say to the leaders who say, I get it. You know what? I hate meetings. You know what we're going to do? We're going to be a culture of not having meetings. We're not calling a meeting. Like, you could twist my arm and we're going to figure out how to not have a meeting because meetings are so unproductive. What do you say to a leader who feels that way?
Yeah, I would probably, like we talked about with disarming leaders, that's obviously a lot of stress, a lot of fear, a lot of insecurity. And I try to slow down as much as I could to find out what the real problem is, because obviously meetings are not the real problem, at least in that particular, as you described that scenario, which I've seen many times. And one of the problems is that person doesn't need to be the leader, because a leader says, yeah, I don't want meetings. They're also just saying, I don't want to manage other people. I don't want to lead hard conversations. I don't want to inspire people because I want to go do something. Here's the reality. And this is actually, I was looking on your notes for this podcast, thinking about, the entrepreneurial dynamic. And I think I've shared this with you, Rich. I do have a bias towards Michael Gerber's work and E-Myth. And, fundamentally, he says, look, people love to do stuff. Astronauts, doctors, cooks, technicians, mechanics, it doesn't matter. People love to do things. And every leader did something, right? It's kind of the classic Michael Scott dynamic, right? You watch The Office on NBC, and for the first 3 seasons, Michael Scott just looks like a total idiot. And then you put him in front of a customer and you realize he's actually a great salesperson. You're like, oh my gosh, this guy used to be a great salesperson. We made him a manager, which he sucks at being a manager. He never was meant to be a manager or a leader. And let's be honest, I mean, E-Myth, Gerber's, proposes that possibly 9 of 10, right? 9 of 10 people who think they're an entrepreneur are not. And if you applied that to leadership, it's a gut check. And when Pat came out with the motive, he just said, maybe less people should be leaders. Maybe less people should aspire to that and just recognize they'd rather be doing than managing or leading. And you look at those five things in the motive around having hard conversations and leading meetings. That's one of the things that leaders need to embrace, because it's their job. If the meeting sucks, it's because the leader's probably doing a bad job of leading the meeting.
Gordon, I just want to clarify something. You said 9 out of 10 people who think they are an entrepreneur are not. Did you mean leader or did you mean entrepreneur?
Well, both and. I mean, I think a lot of leaders see themselves as entrepreneurial.
Okay.
And depending on the life cycle of the organization, it's possible that the organization doesn't need an entrepreneurial type leader. But I was just basically quoting Gerber. If Gerber's saying 9 of 10 who think they're an entrepreneur, I just wonder, out of 10 leaders who think, hey, I'm a great leader, or I should be the leader, have
Gotcha.
really questioned and said, I don't know. Why am I in this position?
Gotcha.
It's hard to know.
It's tying in order to be an entrepreneur, you need to be a good leader of people, which I don't
Right.
dispute. I think that there's a lot of entrepreneurs that have done really, really, really well in their lifetime who are not great leaders, but they're really good entrepreneur, and they surround themselves with good leaders to help lead the organization, to host the meetings that they don't want to be in.
Yeah. Or just recognize, hey, I don't want to be the CEO. I want to be on the team. And so I have the humility to go, hey, John, you're going to be the CEO. Let's say I, built some sort of tech or app or something. It's like, yeah, I'm not the CEO. I was the entrepreneur who had the idea. John, you be the CEO. Rich, you're going to be chief sales officer. I just love to be on the team. What I find more often is that those entrepreneurs or founders are kind of like the highest ranking visitor to their own meeting, right? To their own organization. And they kind of show up.
Yeah.
They have a lot of power, but they're not really bringing leadership, and it causes a ton of confusion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you had talked about the preference to action, the preference to do stuff. Presumably, every entrepreneur listening that has people who work in their company, everybody is filling a 40-hour plus work week doing something. Not like people have a lot of extra time.
Right.
how does an organization make sure they have people not just doing a bunch of stuff, but doing the right things in the right order and doing the most important stuff and not just doing a bunch of stuff, just being busy? How does an organization or a leader make that happen?
Yeah. Well, if it's like if we're assuming that everyone does something, they start off their career or their life doing something, then going from doer to manager, and I think from manager to leader are both change points. And so it strikes the question about managing change. And we love William Bridges' work on managing transitions, and he presupposes that change is loss. When we're changing, we're losing something. And I think that's what is probably a lot of true great entrepreneurs. They're experiencing loss as something goes from infancy to adolescence to maturity and so forth through the life cycle of either a product or an initiative or a company. And I think what we don't do, Rich, is we don't help people manage that loss. And so if I say, hey, Rich, you're a great doer. Let's say you own a franchise. And I say, wow, you'd be really great as a GM. And you're like, yeah, that sounds great. It's going to be more opportunity, probably more money. It's a promotion. Sounds great. And then you don't realize I just lost 7 things that I hold so dear. It's kind of like the Captain Kirk. Remember Captain Kirk? He loved being in the starship, and then he got promoted to admiral. I was like, I don't want to be an admiral. That sucks. I want to be in a starship, right? And I think a lot of people, they don't manage that transition very well, and they don't recognize that getting a promotion is actually tremendous loss, a loss of identity, a loss of turf, a loss of control in their experience. And they're getting into a new space and wondering, well, how do I manage this? I didn't ask to be a leader. And yet I have to embrace that role. Yeah.
When it comes to leadership teams, whether it be a company of 3 or a company of 10,000,
okay,
how should a leader go about selecting who is on their leadership team?
Yeah, great question, and very carefully. And I think most leaders I work with now, I try to re-ask that question regardless of how long they've been together as a team. And I think the ideal team player is a great start. Honestly, that's why Pat wrote that book. Is okay. What's the situation when someone's going to show up? How do we want them to show up? We want them to show up humble, hungry, and smart. And I ask leaders to take the roster of their current team, put it aside, and just ask a couple of hard questions. Number one is, are they humble, hungry, and smart? And they have to balance all 3 of those virtues together. And Pat has a lot of great stuff on seeing how people may show up in different ways without all 3 of those virtues. But the second question, Rich, which is so funny because leaders really squirm when I ask this question, is what help do you need? Who do you need help with or help from to make the hard decisions? Because a lot of leaders have teams and they're really using the team as a vehicle for implementation, not for strategy. And when I look at them, I say, which one of these people do you really respect to go toe to toe with you, to challenge you, to disagree with you? And they start laughing and looking at me and oh yeah, I mean, so-and-so, I love this person, but I mean, I honestly don't respect any of their ideas. There's no way they're ever going to change my mind. I'm like, okay, well, that's a bit disingenuous to invite them to a leadership team when you don't actually respect them from an intellectual standpoint. So I think it has to be that smart and healthy. We talk about smart and healthy. So the humble, hungry, smart says, hey, Rich is a healthy person. He's going to be a healthy presence on this team, but you have to be smart as well. It's like, okay, not just EQ. I also want your IQ. I want to know you're going to make my ideas better. You're going to go toe to toe with me. I do use a companion work that's not very well known. It's called Courageous Follower by Ira Shalev. I'm not sure if you've ever heard that. He has a really simple 2x2 matrix, and he just says, how supportive are they? How supportive is a follower on my team? And how much do they challenge me? And then he's got a really cool way to break down those two things. He laughs at the beginning of the book. He says, well, it's ironic because for every 100 books on leaders, there's probably 1 book on followers. And yet for every 1 leader, there's 100 followers. So it's a reverse. We have so many books on leadership. Who's going to tell me how to be a great team member? I'm working with an organization right now where there's probably going to be some leadership transitions and whatnot. And people, when people see that void, they start to maneuver, right? Hey, I'll be the CEO, or why don't you be the CEO? I'm not sure, right? I'm like, the more interesting question is, who are the ideal team players who are willing to not be the CEO and still show up as a great leader and be willing to follow the future CEO? Those are the people you really need. And it's not just saying, I'll just take a back seat and Rich, you make all the decisions. No, we love leadership teams that truly go into that room and duke it out and have really healthy conflict and be able to say, we made a great decision because we operated as a team, not because the CEO just made the decision and then we all nodded our heads.
What would be your suggestions on book reads for how to be a great follower?
That was one of them. I'm trying to think of others. I mean, Ideal Team Player is a great resource as well. It's very convicting for all of us in terms of how we show up. I'll think about some other ones, but honestly, when he said that, and Ira Shallow said that at the beginning of Courageous Follower, I thought, shoot, I can't name another book that's explicitly written for just being a great team member.
Gordon, you spoke a little bit about asking a leader a question, which is something, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it was something along the lines of, who helps you make the tough decisions?
Mm-hmm.
How does Pat Lencioni or the Table Group, when you work with companies and you start working with their leadership team and realize that that leader may have people on their team that aren't courageous followers, don't fit the values, but that leader and entrepreneur is keeping that person, because that was the first person they hired 3 years ago when they started the company, that took a pay cut to be there and their heart's in it too much. I see a lot of entrepreneurs in small businesses specifically that stick with the loyalty factor versus the what they need to get them to the next step factor, right? What got you here won't get you there. It was an example of a book, right? How do you guys work with entrepreneurs in that facet? I see that as being a pretty big problem with small business and entrepreneurs.
For sure. I mean, and I'm sure if you talk to a classic entrepreneur, I mean, think about how often things change in a year or a month if you're at the beginning of an initiative or a new company. And I guess the reality is we have to embrace turnover. If I said turnover, you'd say, well, that sounds bad.
That's negative.
It's not. It's totally depends. Turnover depends. And managing healthy turnover is really important, especially for entrepreneurs, especially if things are changing really fast, to accept, okay, Rich, I need you for this part of this journey, and you may not be great for the next part. I may not be good for the next part. I'm not sure. We have to embrace the fact that turnover is a reality. The shift is, instead of saying, hey, so John, I know you're in this company, and what do you like to do in your career? And how can I set things up for you, right? We orient around people. This is back to another Gerber axiom, which is you orient around people or you orient around clarity, right? And I think organizations have to orient themselves around the clarity. What does the business need? What do our customers need? So then we're going to orient the team around that. So now back to your point around, hey, you have this team and people are kind of sticking around. I would say embrace turnover and embrace the fact that there's probably one of three options. If they're on your team, they either have to go through their own transformation. Okay, it's like, okay, great, John, welcome to this team. What got you here won't get you there. So what's going to mean on this team is you're going to change. You're going to have to grow in some really key areas. I'm going to push you. And if you want to do that, you're going to go from a B player to an A player, or a C leader to an A leader. Option B is turnover. Let's find you a better seat on a better bus. It might be in this company, it might be somewhere else, but handling that up front, for every 10 times that's an issue, I find one time just normal human beings just have a conversation, and what's ironic is that if a leader came to you and said, hey, this is just not working out, can we talk through this? Most people would say, sure, or vice versa. If someone said, hey, Rich, I don't like working on your team right now, and I want to do something else, which one of your team members would you say, oh, I'm so offended? You say, hey, let's work this out. Let's work out a transition. And that's probably a third option, is just a more smoother transition. So instead of having just to quit or do a flash cut, you could manage a really healthy, maybe 6 to 12 month transition where you, without disrupting the business, you also create transition for people. But think about it, with those three options in a year with an entrepreneur, that could happen monthly, right? That they're constantly reshuffling the deck and figuring out who's going to be on the starting lineup.
I'd asked you a few years ago about some of your favorite books, and one of them was the book Necessary Endings.
Oh my gosh.
So I think about that when you talk about healthy turnover and embrace turnover, and that is an ending. Can you speak to why the book Necessary Endings is one of your favorite books and how that is relevant to turnover?
Yeah, it's huge. Also, Henry Cloud's definitely, I'm a big fan of Henry Cloud. He's a good friend of Pat's as well, and there's a lot of overlap there. I think Dr. Cloud points out a couple things. Back to culture, he says, listen, there's what you reward and there's what you tolerate. That's your choice. Besides that, you can't control a lot. And I think what he helps us do is realize we try to change people. We try to manipulate them. We try to change their behavior. I can't tell you how many people have asked me, hey, Gordon, how do I get so-and-so to do such and such? And when I say you can't, they're like, that's not the answer I was hoping for. But what you can do is make your own choice about what you're going to reward and what you're going to tolerate. And what he says, Dr. Henry Cloud says, basically, when we just try to change people, it's like the teacher on Snoopy. You know, it's like they just want. It comes across as nagging, manipulative. But if we look at people and say, I'm not going to tolerate that anymore, or I say, hey, guys, what Rich just did, that's what I want to see. And I don't care that I'm bragging about him in front of the whole team. That's what I want to see. We're so shy in terms of our rewards and our tolerance. We're so shy and so muted. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. And so then, we end up, to John, to your point, instead of necessary endings, instead of creating those really important milestones in people's lives, we just let things go to the kind of the bitter end. It's like, people say, hey, we've been struggling with so-and-so. And I'll say, well, how long has it been like this? Oh, pretty much 7 years, 8 years, 40 years, especially family businesses. So, I mean, I know we're talking about entrepreneurial, but typically entrepreneurial and family can go hand in hand in the sense that someone's got to start the business.
Sure.
And do they start with a family member, with a brother, with a close friend? Those dynamics play in quite a bit. Family business and entrepreneurial stuff, there's a lot of overlap.
Just a final question or two. If we line up 3 different books that are relatively well known, that I think entrepreneurs look at as potentially in competition with each other. The Advantage by Pat Lencioni, Traction, Gino Wickman, Scaling Up, Vern Harnish. I know you're familiar with all 3. Can you speak to the place in which all 3 sit?
Yeah. If I just drew a continuum and one side was provocation and one side of the continuum was prescription, I think the Advantage is the closest we'll get to prescription, but we live in the provocation world. I think Pat lives in I'm going to share a provocative idea, and I'm going to trust you, Rich, that you're smart enough and you have enough structure to implement it and prescribe it the way you need to. Yeah, we do get a little bit prescriptive, like with the meeting model and a few things like that. But Pat and our work at Table Group is largely provocative to share ideas and then to help people implement it themselves. I think as you go further along that continuum, the other works I've read, and I have read Scaling Up, and I think I've read Traction. But I would just find when I open those books and when I see those other works, I see a much heavier detail around prescription. Like, okay, you're going to do this meeting. Here's the form to fill out. Here's the process step by step. And when 20 years ago, when I was, doing these kind of things, I wanted that. I wanted someone to tell me the steps. I wanted the pre-packaged template, and I needed that. You and I, Rich, when we work with franchises and leaders, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Do they need prescription and me to tell them exactly how to do it, or do they need provocation? And there's a lot of people on that continuum. Our sweet spot is provoking leaders with ideas and walking them through the process, not really prescribing it to them.
Great. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
And last question, what would be the number one thing as you close in your speaking to entrepreneurs that every entrepreneur should be aware of?
Well, I know we've already talked about it, but I mean, if an entrepreneur just said, what do I need to be aware of? I would say your blind spots, and they're called blind spots for a reason. And I think the hardest thing for a leader to do is to go ask other people they trust, what are my blind spots? That could strike to the heart of the very effort. When someone says your blind spot is you're starting something and no one asked for it. No one actually needs what crazy entrepreneurial idea that you have. You need it. you want to do it because you just want to do it, but we don't need it. It could be in the middle of a process where someone's saying, hey, you had a great idea, but your blind spot is you're not an operator. You can't manage this. You got to start getting yourself out of that role that you're in, so this thing can evolve. But just having honest, hard conversations and asking people, what are my blind spots before it's too late. What's ironic, Rich, is that a lot of situations get to a place, 5-10 years in, and we're like, oh man, it's just awful. But then if 5 years ago we could get in a time machine and just warn people early, which would seem a little awkward, but just get out ahead of it. The earlier you ask for feedback, Henry Cloud also says that. He says feedback is exponentially decreases in its effectiveness from the point of incident. So if something happens and I give you immediate feedback, like, hey, that didn't look right, then it's very effective. If we wait for a long time, then things get really cloudy and messy. So
thank you, Gordon. Every time we talk, I learn something and get value, and I know our entrepreneurs listening or watching on YouTube will as well. Thank you for your time today.
You bet. Thank you.
Please stick around for a few more minutes while Rich and I break down this episode.
Rich, I think it was right out of college when I had met you, and we were in this book reading phase, and I still have the book, probably one of the first books I would have bought in the business landscape. I'm pretty sure it was The 5 Temptations of a CEO. And always stuck with me. Very easy to read. Here are the 5 temptations, fable of Pat Lencioni, and that always stuck with me. Obviously, 5 dysfunctions of a team, and I think we went through a whole exercise today of all the books I need to catch up on because there's a lot of his books I haven't read, including a few others. But I just find it amazing that Gordon became a student as an entrepreneur in a business, leading a company, and using these principles, and got so excited about these principles that he actually shows up at their door being probably humble, hungry, and smart, the core values of the table and Pat Lencioni's company, and ends up being part of the leadership team and part of Pat Lencioni's company. So very awesome interview, conversation, and a lot of catching up to do on books.
I think it's really intriguing. He mentioned the book, The Motive. And if you were to read the book, The Motive, one of the things that it'll challenge you on is, one of the things we talked about in the podcast was, are you sure you're cut out to be a leader? It actually challenges that. I think so much of the conditioning that people are conditioned by in companies or even families or the media or movies or everywhere glorifies the leader. And this book, The Motive, really questions, what are your motives to be a leader? Because not everybody is cut out to be a leader, and that's okay. It's glorious to be an excellent follower in an organization that does wonderful things, that you're well compensated, you have great benefits. Don't worry about it. If you're not a leader, that's okay. Here are some ways that you could identify that. I think it was interesting what he brought up, that 9 out of 10 people who think they are leaders maybe aren't. What's your perspective on that from what you've seen?
Yeah, so I struggle with that. I really do. To think that, and just to be clear, when Gordon quoted it, I think it was quoted as 9 out of 10 people who think they are entrepreneurs are not. And I'm not so sure that I subscribe to that, if that's what the E-Myth talks about, because, you have leaders and you have followers, but you have people that aren't good followers either. They want to go in their own lane and they want to produce stuff. You can be an entrepreneur, create something, and then build a leadership team to lead the people. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're not. That's why I had a kind of a question around that, because I think that entrepreneurship and leadership are 2 different things. When I think about leadership, I'm thinking about leading people. If you want to lead people, you got to love people. You want to be with them. You want to help them. You want to engage in all of the peaks and valleys of people, which sometimes can be very stressful, can be very difficult to handle. There's emotions that go around it, and you have some people that just want to produce. They don't want, to your point, they don't want to go to the meeting. They don't want to have meetings with people. They don't want to hire people. They don't have to fire anybody, but they're really creative and they can really help propel a vision of a company. They just don't want to do the people part.
Yeah.
So I think that, everything we talked about today is really important for leaders of companies. And if you're listening to today's conversation as an entrepreneur and you're thinking about, I don't want to have to come up with our meeting strategy. That sucks. I don't want to have to have healthy turnover and deal with those conversations with people. That sucks. You should consider bringing a leader into your business and being humble enough to say, you know what? I know I'm the owner of the business or I'm the entrepreneur and I started this company, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I want to be the leader of people as my company grows. I just want to do what I'm best at, which is strategy, vision, and whatever you do. I think that's really a factor that a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with is to grow a company, they have to lead people, and they're not good at leading people, or their perception of themselves is they're not good at leading people. And that's the issue that I see happening a lot.
Yeah, and an interesting piece to that is part of leading people is having meetings. Like it or not every communication is best done via email or text message. Like it or not everybody in our organizations are fully aligned without being reminded of how their work aligns with the vision, values, and mission, and what they should be doing day to day that is in alignment. Like it or not, people just don't wake up and know that automatically, and you can't send them a text message that says, read our values and do that today. Yep. As a leader, you have to have meetings. I remember at one point, I don't know if it was a video or at a conference, that Pat Lencioni said, you don't want to have meetings, you just shouldn't be a leader. That's the job of a leader, is to have meetings. Whether the meeting is one-on-one, or whether the meeting is with a client, or whether the meeting is with a group or the whole company, that's your job, to have meetings. Well, that's your job. Wouldn't you prefer to have effective meetings that are interesting, that are progressive, that people do pay attention, that people look forward to, that have a purpose? Wouldn't you rather have that? And if you don't want to be in that game, then maybe you shouldn't be leading.
Yeah. And I'll say this though, Rich, like I think that in addition to having meetings and effective meetings with your team, I think you creating a culture and a strategy around meetings, so you don't have to be in all of the meetings, but you're creating the organizational structure for them to be efficient and happen. I think is very, very good. I'll share a story with you that came across in this conversation and I was reminded of. A few years ago, leading an organization with a couple hundred people, and we did a survey with Ruth Lund. Actually, we did a survey of all of the people in the organization, organizational health, where's the culture of the business. And we had a team that was scattered all over the globe. And one of the resounding things that came back was people didn't know where we were going, didn't know the vision, that we weren't communicating enough, a lot of felt disconnected to the organization and everything else. So we put together a plan, Ruth and I and the other leaders of the company, to over communicate, just like Gordon talks about in this conversation. And it probably took 2 years maybe to really get all of the efficiencies going and how we were going to communicate and do it. But within a couple of years, that was completely extinguished from the annual cultural survey of the companies. We don't communicate. We don't know where we're going. We don't know what the vision was. It actually went the other way, where everybody knew exactly where it was. And it was so refreshing to have that kind of monkey off your back, because everybody knows directionally where you're going. And it really helped our organization, propel in one direction as a group. So I really connected with that here today. And that was a little bit of an aha moment for me as a leader, is that over communicate. You don't have to over inform like you talked about, but just being very consistent with the communication process, whether it be a global town hall where, 30 minutes every month, you're saying, here's what's going on with the organization. Here's our mission, vision, values. Here's what we're doing. Anything, but be consistent in your communication. I thought was a huge aha moment for me and my learnings that Gordon, obviously, and Pat Lencioni bring into their process very well.
To tie back to the podcast and the example you just brought up, Gordon talked about healthy turnover. When you made that shift from people not knowing where you're going as an organization to then people did know, did you experience turnover in order to contribute to making that shift? And in hindsight, would you consider it healthy turnover?
No, in that particular example, I think we experienced better retention and better alignment, because people had a better sense of oh, this is what we're about, and this is where we're going, and these are the goals of the organization. And the organization said we were going to do that last year, and oh my gosh, we did it. He said something here: the best organizations call their shot and make the shot.
Yes.
Well, how do people know what the shot even is if you're not communicating it? And so what we started doing, Rich, is we started communicating our shots and hitting them. And people were like, oh my gosh, we said we were going to actually grow our company, by double within the year, and we did. And in your communication process, you would remind them. Remember last year in January, we said, here was our goal for the year. Well, here we are in December. We did it. Congratulations. High five all the way around. We're sending you guys Christmas gifts, whatever. But there was this reinforcement of this communication. And a lot of leaders know where they want to go, but are they communicating it properly? And then are they rewarding and celebrating the success to go, remember as a team, we all said we were going to do this and now we did. So the retention was extremely high versus maybe where it was before, where people were just kind of floundering all over the place, not really sure what we were trying to accomplish.
Yeah. And I love the thought of over communicating, and then reinforcing that clarity in human systems. So some of that communication of whether it be values. A challenge to entrepreneurs listening would be, are you interviewing people actually for those values, or are they hanging on the wall only? When you do a performance review with your people, are you bouncing their performance up against the values? When you do an exit interview with people who are leaving your organization, do you bounce up, how did we do as a company on our values? To tie everything back, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the values. It might be a vision, it might be the mission, it might be a strategy that you want to continue to reinforce in the clarity, but embedding that in the human systems, I think takes it to a whole nother level.